My whole life, I believed that family was the most important thing. I worked day and night to give my children everything they ever dreamed of. On my 85th birthday, they gave me a beautiful gift box, gathering around to capture the moment. They smiled for the camera, but they didn't know I had already opened it. They didn't see what was inside. They thought I was just a sentimental old man, but they had no idea about the gift I had prepared for them, a gift that would destroy their lives just as they had destroyed mine. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. What if I told you that everything you believed was a lie? My name was Benjamin Blake. I was 85 years old, a retired banker. For decades, my life had been a world of numbers and ledgers, of debits and credits, a world where every transaction was meticulously recorded, every calculation precise. I had believed in a world of order and predictability, where the rules were clear and the consequences were absolute. That same principle, I believed, extended to my personal life, my marriage, my family, my home. They were all meticulously designed, a perfect structure of love and loyalty. In my old age, the physical structures of my past were all around me, but the emotional ones, the ones I had trusted the most, were slowly crumbling into dust. My days began not with the jarring sound of an alarm, but with a deep, silent ache in the place where my wife, Eleanor, had slept for over 60 years. I would rise at the first hint of morning light, my body a map of old aches and pains that told the story of a life spent in physical labor, supervising crews, and walking the length of endless construction sites. I didn't turn on a lamp, didn't need to. The house was as familiar as the back of my hand. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph a landmark in the quiet landscape of my solitude. I would pad silently to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking a familiar lament beneath my weight. I made a pot of coffee, a simple black brew, the way she had always made it for me. I sat at the small two-person table, the other chair permanently empty, a ghost at my breakfast. I used to spend my mornings reading the paper, but lately, the words seemed to blur together, the headlines about a world I no longer recognized. My mind was a busy place, filled with memories that came unbidden, like old blueprints unrolling themselves in the dark. I could see the day I first met Eleanor, her vibrant red dress a splash of color against the drab gray of the city hall. I remembered the way her hand felt in mine, the gentle squeeze that promised a future of warmth and companionship. I remembered the first home we built together, a small two-bedroom cottage that we paid for with my first big paycheck. I had designed every single wall, every foundation, thinking of the life we would build within them. After my coffee, I walked through the house, a quiet ritual of remembrance. I touched the old wooden banister, worn smooth by the passage of time and the hands of our children. My own hand felt rough, calloused from years of holding a measuring tape and a pencil, but I found a strange comfort in the texture. In the living room, I stopped. I ran my hand over the antique desk she had loved so much, its surface scarred with decades of use. My gaze fell to the floor, to a particular spot under the faded Persian rug. I knelt down, my old knees protesting with a soft groan, and reached my hand underneath the corner of the rug. My fingers found the familiar indentation in the floorboards. It was the only part of this house that was mine and mine alone. It held a secret that no one, not even Eleanor, had ever known about. It was my last piece of leverage in a world that was threatening to take everything from me. I spent most of my days in my study, a sanctuary filled with books and old engineering plans. The smell of aged paper and leather filled the air, a scent that transported me back to a different time, when my greatest challenge was designing a new overpass or a water treatment facility. I would sit for hours at my drafting table, the tools of my trade laid out before me. I didn't draw anymore. My hands, once so steady and precise, now trembled with a slight, persistent tremor. Instead, I would look at the old plans, tracing the lines of a suspension bridge with a fingertip, remembering the men who had worked under me, the steel beams they had hoisted into place, the sweat on their brows and the pride in their eyes when the project was complete. I was a man who built things. I built communities. I built a home. I built a family. I never thought any of them could be dismantled so easily. In the afternoon, the silence of the house would become a heavy blanket, a crushing weight. I would often go out, not for any purpose, but just to feel the sun on my face and to see other people. I would walk to the small park at the end of the street, a place I had helped design 20 years ago. The swings were still there, the rusty chains creaking in the wind, and the path I had laid was still firm under my feet. I saw young families laughing, children chasing each other with reckless joy. A pang of regret would hit me, a dull throb in my chest. I had been too busy building, too preoccupied with my work to truly appreciate the simple moments. I had missed so much. When I returned, the house was just as I had left it, empty. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stillness. It was a beautiful home, I had to admit, a monument to a life of hard work. The garden was still tended, even though Eleanor was no longer here to enjoy the flowers. I did it for her, for the memory of her. The rose bushes, the hydrangeas, every bloom a testament to a love I had believed was true. It was in the midst of this mundane routine, this quiet, orderly existence, that my world was about to be shaken to its very core. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a color palette Eleanor had loved. I was sitting in her favorite armchair, looking at a framed photograph of us from our honeymoon. We were so young, so full of life and hope. My phone, a modern contraption that felt foreign in my hand, buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from Marilyn, our daughter. The text was short, a single line of cold, impersonal words. "The papers have arrived. We'll be there tomorrow." A small, insignificant phrase that would rip the perfectly designed foundation of my life apart. It was just an ordinary day, but it was the last ordinary day I would ever know. What if everything you were taught was obsolete? The lessons I had taught them, about honor, about loyalty, about the sanctity of a family, were nothing more than relics from a different time. My name was Benjamin Blake, and I was 85 years old. My home, once a quiet sanctuary of memory and solitude, was now a stage. The air, which had been thick with the scent of old paper and dust, was now cloying with the smell of cheap balloons and store-bought frosting. The front door, a heavy, silent barrier against the world, was thrown open with a joyful, jarring cry. They had arrived. My daughter Anna, a woman with a smile as wide as her ambitions, and my son Robert, a man who carried the weight of his unyielding greed on his shoulders. They came in a whirlwind of noise and color, a small chaotic procession of grandchildren, balloons, and gifts. They were a perfect, polished image of a loving family, a scene from a magazine cover. Anna hugged me, her embrace too tight, too brief, a practice gesture that felt as hollow as her forced laughter. Robert patted me on the back, a rough, impatient gesture that was more of a public statement than a sign of affection. They were here for my birthday, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they were here for something more. Their eyes, though bright with feigned excitement, were darting around the room, taking in every detail of my home, a home that they now saw as nothing more than a potential asset. They laid out their offerings on my kitchen table, a sterile assortment of party supplies and a small unadorned cake with 85 candles. They sang to me, their voices a little off-key, a little too loud, and their smiles were so wide, so bright, they seemed to be a physical presence in the room. They all smiled for the camera as they began to unwrap the gift. My grandson, Michael, a young boy with his mother's eyes but his grandfather's quiet, watchful demeanor, held up a small black phone and took a picture. The flash was a blinding, jarring light in the quiet stillness of my home. It was a perfect moment, a perfect picture, a perfect lie. Do you know what people really think of you? I saw it now, in their eyes. The contempt, the pity, the cold, calculating look of a man and a woman who saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle. They thought I was a sad, confused old man who was in the way. They thought I was a problem to be solved. They had no idea that I was a man who had spent his entire life in a world of numbers and ledgers, a world where every transaction had to be precise, every calculation absolute. I was a man who had made a fortune by knowing the value of things, and they had no idea that I was about to show them that they had no idea what a true value was. The gift they had brought me was a large, beautiful box, wrapped in shimmering gold paper and tied with a thick crimson bow. It was an expensive box, a testament to their success, a symbol of their wealth. But I saw it for what it truly was. It was a bribe. It was a peace offering. It was a gilded cage, a beautiful lie meant to lull me into a false sense of security. They placed the box in my lap, its weight a heavy, unnatural presence on my old, tired legs. They all smiled for the camera as they urged me to open it, their voices filled with a false, practiced joy. I lifted the lid and looked inside. The box was empty. It was just a box. It was nothing. A symbol of the emptiness in their own hearts, a symbol of the nothingness they had become. How much of your life have you already wasted? That was a question I had asked myself 1,000 times, a philosophical musing on a quiet, solitary afternoon. But on that day, as I held the empty box in my lap, I realized that I had wasted my life on a lie. I had spent a lifetime building a family, a home, a life for a son and a daughter who saw me as nothing more than an asset. I had invested my entire life in a future that was not mine, a future that was nothing more than a lie. My heart, once a cold, empty tomb, was now a small, hard stone, a silent, unmoving core of resolve. The time for the truth was now. The time for the final revelation had come. They thought they had defeated me. They had no idea that their victory was about to become their greatest defeat. The conversation that followed was a painful, silent dance of unspoken words and hidden intentions. They talked about their jobs, about their homes, about their cars. They spoke of the future, a future that was filled with promises of a long, healthy life, a future that was filled with promises of a peaceful, solitary existence. They were trying to convince me, trying to wear me down, trying to make me see that the only logical thing to do was to sell my home and move into a home for the elderly, a home that was nothing more than a gilded cage. They had no idea that I was a man who had spent his entire life in a world of numbers and ledgers, a world where every transaction had to be precise, every calculation absolute. I was a man who had made a fortune by knowing the value of things, and they had no idea that I was about to show them that they had no idea what a true value was. They began to ask their questions, their voices a low, casual murmur. "Dad," Anna said, her voice filled with a fake, practiced sweetness. "Do you still have those old bank statements?" Robert, his eyes filled with a quiet, hungry greed, asked about the location of my safe, about the keys to my lockbox. The questions were a casual, careless gesture, a polite veneer that barely concealed the threat beneath them. They were not asking. They were demanding. They had come to take what they believed was theirs. They had no idea that I was a man who had a plan, a man who had a secret that would destroy their lives, just as they had destroyed mine. The game had just begun, and I was going to make sure that in the end, They would pay for their greed, for their lies, for their betrayal. Are you ready for the shocking truth? The birthday celebration was over. The cake, a small, unadorned confection, sat on the table between us, a stark reminder of the meal they had so carefully staged for my benefit. My daughter Anna and my son Robert sat across from me, their faces no longer wreathed in fake smiles, but in a cold, determined resolve. The pretense of a loving family gathering was over. The time for the truth had come. My son Robert was the first to speak. He didn't use words. He just reached into his leather briefcase, a slick, modern object that looked jarringly out of place in my old rustic home. He pulled out a thick manila folder, its contents a silent, unmoving threat. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone what was inside. The papers rustled as he laid them on the table, the sound a low, ominous whisper in the quiet room. Anna nodded, her eyes filled with a cold, unwavering resolve. They were a team, a united front, and they were here to dismantle the last piece of my life that I held sacred. "Dad," Robert said, his voice a low, somber rumble. "We know you love us. We do. But you just can't take care of yourself anymore." He spoke of it with a cold, detached professionalism, as if he were discussing a business deal, not my life. Anna, her voice a low, mournful sigh, spoke of my forgetfulness, of my lack of energy. They spoke of me as a burden, a heavy, unnecessary weight on their shoulders, a problem that they, in their wisdom, were here to solve. They were not talking about a father. They were talking about a liability. "It's just money, Dad," Anna said, her voice filled with a calm, condescending patience. Her words were a hammer, a sharp, brutal blow to the very core of my being. She had just invalidated a lifetime of hard work, a lifetime of promises, with a single careless phrase. "Do you know your true worth?" That was a question I had never truly asked myself. I had always measured my worth in promises kept, in bridges built, in the quiet, unspoken love that had defined my life. But on that Sunday evening, as the last of the sun's light faded from the sky, I was about to be given a new measure, a cold, brutal assessment of my value in the eyes of my own children. They were talking about money, about a potential fortune, about the assets they could get from my bank accounts. They had no idea that the value of my life was not in the money they were trying to take. It was in the dignity they were trying to steal. They had no idea that the value of my life was in a promise, a love, a truth that was more sacred than any contract. They pushed the papers towards me, a silent, unmoving demand. The papers were a physical manifestation of their betrayal. They were a contract, a final, unyielding document that would end a promise that Eleanor and I had so carefully guarded. My hand, which had spent a lifetime building a banking empire, was now trembling with a quiet, uncontrollable rage. I was a man who had believed in the sanctity of a promise, and they were a man and a woman who were about to tear that sanctity to shreds. I wanted to stand up, to scream, to throw the papers in their faces. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed. My heart was a cold, empty tomb, and my mind was a frantic, chaotic mess. The betrayal was not just the papers. The betrayal was the look in their eyes, the cold, distant look of people who saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle. The betrayal was the way they spoke of me, the casual, careless way they dismissed a lifetime of memories. The betrayal was the way they looked at me, with a cold, pitying contempt that was more painful than any physical blow. They thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were helping me, but they were not. They were betraying a promise, a love, a life. They were a man and a woman who had been blinded by their own greed, a greed that was now a silent, suffocating presence in my home. I sat there, a silent, unmoving presence in my own living room, the papers a silent, unyielding threat on the table before me. I was a man who had believed in rules, but I was about to find out that the rules had changed, and that I was the only one who didn't know the new game. My heart was a cold, empty tomb, my mind a frantic, chaotic mess. I was a man who had lost everything, but I was also a man who had just found a new purpose. My peaceful, solitary life had been shattered, and a new, more dangerous chapter had just begun. What would you do if you had only one day left? Would you spend it on a piece of paper, on a sum of money, on a life that was nothing more than a lie? Or would you spend it on a promise, on a memory, on a love that was true? I looked at my children, at the cold, calculating look in their eyes, and I knew the answer. They would have chosen the money. They would have chosen the lie. They had no idea that for me the answer was already clear. The dignity I had lost was more valuable than any money they could have ever offered me. The promise I had made to Eleanor was more sacred than any contract. The game had just begun, and I was going to make sure that in the end they would pay for their greed, for their lies, for their betrayal. The last echoes of their footsteps on the porch, the final crunch of their tires on the gravel driveway, were the last sounds I heard before a profound, bone-deep silence settled over the house. My children had left. They had left me with a pile of legal papers and a heart full of a pain so deep, so consuming, it was almost a physical presence in the room. I stood there, in the middle of my living room, the space that had once been a sanctuary, now a battlefield. The papers they had left behind sat on the coffee table, a silent, unmoving threat. They were a testament to their betrayal, a cold, calculated act of a son and a daughter who saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle to be overcome. I was a man who had been a fool, a man who had believed that a promise could be stronger than greed. I had lost. I had been humiliated. I had been defeated. I felt a profound, gut-wrenching emptiness, a void where my love for them had once been. They had not just broken a promise. They had broken my heart. I walked to the bookshelf, my feet dragging on the old floorboards. The books were old, their spines cracked and faded, their pages yellowed with age. They were a testament to a life of quiet reflection, a life of knowledge and wisdom. I ran my hand over the spines, my fingers tracing the titles of books I had read 1,000 times. I found it, a small black box, hidden behind a row of old dictionaries. It was a voice recorder, a gift from my father from so many years ago. It was a relic from a different time, a time when a man's word was his bond, a time when a promise was a sacred thing. I took it out, its weight a familiar comfort in my trembling hands. I looked at it, its small black body a silent, unmoving presence in my hand, and a new feeling began to stir within me. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was a cold, hard resolve. They thought they had defeated me. They thought I was just a sad, confused old man who would be too weak to fight back. They thought I was just a pawn in their game, a means to an end. They had no idea that I was a man who had spent his entire life in a world of numbers and ledgers, a world where every transaction had to be precise, every calculation absolute. What will happen if you stop limiting yourself? This thought came to me as I looked at the recorder in my hand. It was not a time machine that could take me back to the past. It was a time machine that could bring the past to the present. It was a way to tell my story, a way to reveal a truth that they had no idea existed. It was a way to turn the tables on them, to turn their victory into a bitter, devastating defeat. I walked to my study, a room that had always been my sanctuary, a place of order and logic in a chaotic world. I turned on a small lamp on my desk, the soft glow illuminating the rows of books and the old drafting tools. I sat down in my leather armchair, the worn upholstery molding to my body like a second skin. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the air in my lungs feeling cold and sharp. I had a story to tell, and I was going to tell it in my own way, on my own terms. I was not going to be a victim. I was going to be a man who had finally, truly found his voice. I pressed the record button, the small red light blinking on, a single defiant beacon in the darkness. My voice, when I began to speak, was a low, steady rumble, a sound that felt foreign and heavy on my tongue. "My name is Benjamin Blake," I said, the words a quiet, final pronouncement. "And this is my confession." I paused, the words hanging in the air, a silent, unmoving presence. This was not a confession of guilt. This was a confession of a life, a reckoning of the lies and deceptions that had led me to this moment. I was not going to tell them about the papers. I was not going to tell them about the betrayal. I was going to tell them about the truth they didn't know about, the truth that would tear their perfect lives apart. What would happen if you stopped limiting yourself? They had limited me. They had limited me to the quiet solitude of my old age, to the silent grief of my wife's passing, to the humiliating, condescending pity of their gaze. They had no idea that I was a man who had just been set free. I had nothing left to lose. My dignity had been taken. My promise had been broken. My heart had been shattered. I was an empty vessel, a man who was now filled with a cold, terrifying resolve. They had no idea that in their moment of triumph, they had just awoken a sleeping giant. The game had just begun, and I was going to make sure that in the end, they would pay for their greed, for their lies, for their betrayal. I spent the rest of the night talking into the recorder, my voice a steady, unwavering stream of words in the quiet of my study. I told the story of my life, the parts they knew, and the parts they didn't. I spoke of the day I first met Eleanor, of the day we were married, of the promises we had made. And then I spoke of the things they didn't know, the lies, the deceptions, the secrets that had been buried for so long. I spoke of the man I had once been, a man who had believed in the sanctity of a promise, a man who had believed in love. And I spoke of the man I was now, a man who had learned that a life, just like a building, could be built on a foundation of lies and deceit. I was a broken man, but I was not defeated. I had a story to tell, and I had a secret to reveal. And when I was done, their world would be in ruins, just as mine had been. The new dawn was coming, and I was going to be there to see it. How much money do you lose every day without knowing it? That was a question they understood. That was the only language they spoke. The morning after they had left, a profound and absolute silence filled the house, but it was a different kind of silence than the one I had known. It was no longer a silence of grief, but a silence of cold, quiet purpose. My heart, which had been a cold, empty tomb, was now a small, hard stone, a silent, unmoving core of resolve. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long, long time, I felt a sense of control. They thought they had defeated me. They had no idea that their victory was about to become their greatest defeat. The game had just begun, and I was going to make sure that in the end, they would pay for their greed, for their lies, for their betrayal. My first move was not a grand gesture of defiance. It was a small, quiet act, a single step on a long, winding road. I walked to my study, a room that had always been my sanctuary, my place of order and logic. I opened the old wooden desk, its surface scarred with decades of use, its drawers filled with a lifetime of memories. I sifted through old letters, faded photographs, and yellowed documents, my fingers, rough and calloused from a lifetime of labor, searching for a specific memory, a specific moment in time. I found it in a small black box, a box that Eleanor had given me for my birthday so many years ago. I opened the lid, and inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a small black and white photograph, The photo was old, its edges curled with age, its surface worn with the passage of time. It was a picture of my son, Robert, a boy of 16, his face a mask of youthful innocence. But he was not alone. He was standing next to a man I did not recognize. He was older, with a cold, distant look in his eyes. He was not a boy. He was a man. He had his arm around him, a possessive, almost threatening gesture. I had looked at this photo 1,000 times, and I had never seen it before. I had dismissed it as a simple picture of a boy with a friend. I had been a fool. I had been a man who had believed in the honesty of his children, in the loyalty of his family, in the sanctity of a promise. I had no idea that the photograph was a silent, unmoving witness to a truth that had been buried for years. What if I told you that you have no idea what you're doing? My children thought they were so clever, so cunning. They thought they had cornered an old man, a man who was too weak, too sad to fight back. They had no idea that I was a man who had spent his entire life in a world of numbers and ledgers, a man who had learned to read the signs, to anticipate the dangers. They had no idea that their greed, their betrayal, their contempt was about to become their undoing. They had no idea that the game they had started was a game they had no hope of winning. I walked to the telephone, a landline, a relic from a different time, and I dialed a number I had not called in years. It was the number of my old friend, a man named George, a man who had been a police chief in the next town over for 30 years. He was a man of logic and order, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had somehow, miraculously, managed to keep his soul intact. He answered the phone, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Ben?" he said, his voice filled with a quiet, hesitant surprise. "It's been a while." I didn't waste any time with pleasantries. I just told him I had a job for him. I told him I had a photograph, a name, a mystery that needed to be solved. I told him it was about my family. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask for details. He just told me he would be at my house in an hour. He knew me. He knew that if I was calling him after so many years of silence, it was for a reason that was more important than any social call. I hung up the phone and walked to the kitchen. The silence was now a living, breathing thing, a quiet, powerful presence that filled every corner of every room. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and fresh-cut pine, a smell that was a familiar, comforting presence in a world that was now filled with chaos and uncertainty. I sat down at the kitchen table, a place that had once been a place of love and laughter, and I waited. I was not a man who was used to waiting. I was a man who was used to action, a man who was used to building things. But now, I was a man who was waiting. And in my heart, I knew that the waiting was just the beginning. How will you find out your true worth? That was a question they would soon be asking themselves. They had believed their worth was in the money they would get from my bank accounts. They had no idea that their true worth would be measured in the loss of their family, in the loss of their dignity, in the loss of their souls. They had believed their worth was in the lies they had told, in the secrets they had kept. They had no idea that their true worth would be revealed in the final, painful, humiliating moment of truth. The front door opened, and a few minutes later, the air was filled with a familiar scent of old paper and dust. George was here. I didn't need to ask him. I didn't need to see him. I just knew. He was a man who had spent his life in the trenches, a man who had learned to read the signs, to anticipate the dangers. He was a man who had come to me for a fight. He had come to me to help me find a truth that had been buried for so long. He had no idea that the truth was about to be revealed, not with a bang, but with a quiet, dignified confession. He had no idea that the game had just begun, and I was going to make sure that in the end, they would pay for their greed, for their lies, for their betrayal. Do you know what people really think of you? That was a question I had never truly asked myself. I had always believed that people saw me as a man of honor, a man of integrity, a man of my word. I had no idea that my son saw me as a man who was easy to fool, a man who was easy to lie to, a man who was just a means to an end. It was a cold, rainy November evening. I had just gotten home from a long, grueling day at the bank, my body aching with fatigue, my mind buzzing with the complexities of new financial regulations. I was tired, but I was happy. My bonus, a thick, crisp wad of bills, was in my wallet. It was a hard-earned bonus, a testament to a year of honest, back-breaking labor. I had put my wallet in my briefcase and had gone to take a shower, a small, simple ritual of a man who was just happy to be home. When I came back, the wallet was still in my briefcase, but the money was gone. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there in the middle of my kitchen, a cold, empty feeling spreading through my body. The money wasn't a lot. It was just a few $1,000s. But it was a part of my bonus. It was a part of my honest, hard-earned money. I walked to Robert's room, my heart a cold, empty tomb. I didn't knock. I just opened the door, a small, quiet act of a man who was terrified of what he was about to find. He was sitting at his desk, his face a mask of concentration, his hands on a stack of new magazines. He was a boy who loved to read, a boy who loved to learn. He was a boy who was not supposed to have so much money. I looked at him, and in his eyes I saw not a boy who was afraid, but a boy who was triumphant. He had a small, almost imperceptible smile on his face, a smile that was a silent, unmoving admission of guilt. He had stolen the money. He had taken it from me. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He knew. He knew that I knew. And in that moment, I saw him for what he truly was. Not a good boy, but a boy who was driven by a cold, unwavering greed. He had no conscience. He had no shame. He had no remorse. What if everything you were taught was obsolete? The lessons I had taught him, the values I had tried to instill in him, honesty, loyalty, the sanctity of a promise, were now just words, empty platitudes from a different time. They were of a different world, a world where the only thing that mattered was money, where the only thing that was real was a dollar sign. I had been a fool. I had believed that I could raise a boy who was like me, a man who believed in the value of an honest day's work, a man who believed in the value of a promise. I had no idea that my son was a boy who was a part of a new generation, a generation that understood the value of things in terms of dollars and cents, not in terms of promises and memories. I didn't confront him. I didn't tell Eleanor. I just walked away, a silent, unmoving presence in my own home. I was a man who had spent his life building a banking empire, and I had just discovered that the boy I had raised was a man who was a destroyer, a man who would tear down anything for the sake of his own greed. I had made a mistake. I had buried the truth. I had hidden the evidence. I had been a fool. And now, all these years later, the truth was back. It was back to haunt me. It was back to destroy me. It was back to prove that the betrayal I had just endured was not a new thing. It was an old thing. It was a part of a long, long history of lies and deceit that had defined my life, a history that was about to be revealed. The game had just begun, and I was going to make sure that in the end, they would pay for their greed, for their lies, for their betrayal. What would you do if you had only one day left? That was a question I had asked myself 1,000 times, a philosophical musing on a quiet, solitary afternoon. But on that morning, as the sound of a car engine filled the quiet of my driveway, I realized that the question was no longer for me. It was for them. My children had returned, but this time, the polite facade of a loving family had been completely torn off. The car, a sleek black sedan that looked like a bird of prey, came to a screeching halt in front of my house. The doors opened, and they emerged. My son, Robert, a man whose face was a mask of cold, determined fury, and my daughter Anna, a woman whose eyes were filled with a wild, uncontrollable rage. They didn't have a birthday cake. They had a purpose. They were a team, a united front, and they had come to reclaim what they believed was theirs. They didn't ring the doorbell. They just came in, the front door swinging open with a loud, impatient thud. They didn't ask me how I was. They didn't ask me how I was holding up. They just stood there, in the middle of my living room, their bodies a silent, unmoving threat. My son was the first to speak, his voice a low, furious hiss. "Dad," he said, his words a cold, sharp blade. "What are you doing? George called us. He says you've been digging up old stories. He says you're trying to stop the sale. You have no right." His words were a cold, brutal slap to the face, a public, unambiguous statement of my new status in this family. I was no longer a father. I was an obstacle. I was a problem to be solved. My daughter Anna, her voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of rage and fear, took a step towards me. "We're worried about you, Dad," she said, her voice filled with a practiced, saccharine sweetness that felt more like a threat than a concern. "We think you're getting confused. We think you're not well." Her words were a lie, a cruel, calculated act of a woman who was trying to convince me, and herself, that I was a sad, confused old man who needed to be taken care of. "We think you need help," she said, her words a final devastating blow. "We think you need to be in a place where you can be taken care of." The threat was clear. They were going to try to have me committed. They were going to try to prove I was unfit to manage my own affairs. They were going to take everything from me. I didn't answer. I just stood there, a silent, unmoving presence in my own home. I was a man who had been a banker for 50 years, a man who had learned to read the signs, to anticipate the dangers. I had no idea that my own children would be the greatest threat I had ever faced. What if everything you were taught was obsolete? The lessons I had taught them, the values I had tried to instill in them, honesty, loyalty, the sanctity of a promise, were now just words, empty platitudes from a different time. They were of a different world, a world where the only thing that mattered was money, where the only thing that was real was a dollar sign. They had forgotten the value of a promise. They had forgotten the value of a life. They had forgotten the value of love. They continued to talk, their voices a low, furious murmur, their words a constant, unyielding attack. They spoke of the documents, of the will, of the money. They spoke of my refusal to sign the papers, of my stubborn, illogical resistance to their plans. They spoke of me as if I were a stranger, as if I were a problem to be solved, not a father to be loved. I looked at them, at the cold, calculating look in their eyes, and I felt a strange, cold fury building inside me. They thought they were being logical. They thought they were being practical. They had no idea that they were tearing down a part of themselves, a part of their own history, a part of their own family. They were destroying a legacy for the sake of a few pieces of paper. They were tearing down a home for the sake of a few extra dollars in their bank account. And then, I heard a sound behind me. It was a soft, hesitant step, a quiet, cautious movement. I turned my head and saw him. It was my grandson, Michael. He had come to see me. He had come to my house on a Sunday, a boy who was supposed to be at home, a boy who had no idea what was happening. His eyes, so wide and innocent, were filled with a quiet, terrified horror. He had been at the house a few hours ago, but now he had returned. He had seen the car. He had heard the voices. He had come to see what was happening to his grandfather. He looked at me, and his eyes, unlike his parents', were not filled with suspicion or judgment. They were filled with confusion, with a quiet, questioning wonder. He had heard the cold, cruel words his parents had just spoken. He had seen the look on their faces, and he had come to me. I looked at him, and in his eyes I saw not a boy who was afraid, but a boy who was seeking the truth. He was a silent witness, a quiet rebellion against his own family. He was a small flickering light of hope in the vast, empty darkness of my life. My daughter's voice, which had been a low, furious murmur, now faltered. She saw him. She saw the look on his face. She saw the silent, judging stare of her own son. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt, a flicker of fear in her eyes. My son, too, his body a looming threat, now stood frozen in place, his face a mask of furious confusion. They had come to me for a fight. They had come to me for a victory. But they had just met a new, unexpected enemy, a new ally, a new hope. The game had just begun, and I was going to make sure that in the end they would pay for their greed, for their lies, for their betrayal. Are you ready for a shocking truth? My grandson's presence in the doorway had turned the tide. My daughter Anna and her husband Robert stood frozen, their furious energy now a cold, contained rage. They had come to me for a fight, but they had just met a new, unexpected enemy. The silent, unblinking presence of their own son, Michael, was a more powerful threat than any legal document I could have presented. He was a small, quiet rebellion, a single unwavering beacon of truth in a room filled with deceit. They looked at him, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt, a flicker of fear in their eyes. They had been so consumed by their greed, by their desire for my money, that they had forgotten that they were also parents. They had forgotten that their son was watching, and he had just seen the cold, brutal violence that lay beneath their perfect, polished veneer. I didn't waste a second. I didn't need to. The time for words was over. The time for action had begun. I reached for the old rotary telephone on the small table in the hallway. It was a relic from a different time, a time when a phone call was a deliberate, intentional act, not a casual, thoughtless gesture. My daughter's eyes, wide with a silent, questioning panic, followed my hand. My son's face, once a mask of cold, determined fury, was now a portrait of fear and confusion. They had no idea what I was doing. They had no idea that I was about to reveal a truth that would destroy their lives, a truth that would expose them for what they truly were. I lifted the receiver, the plastic cold and heavy in my hand, and carefully, deliberately, began to dial the number. The rotary dial spun with a slow, mechanical whir, a sound that was a jarring contrast to the tense, silent stillness of the room. What if everything you were taught was obsolete? They had been taught that money was power. They had been taught that legal documents were the only things that mattered. They had been taught that the old, sentimental ways of a man like me were a sign of weakness, a thing to be exploited, a thing to be discarded. They had no idea that a single phone call, a single conversation, could be more powerful than any legal contract, more devastating than any lawsuit. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then I heard a voice on the other end, a familiar gravelly rumble. It was my friend, George. I had called him this morning. I had given him a job. And now he was about to give me the information that would turn this entire game on its head. I pressed the small, almost invisible button on the side of the receiver. The speakerphone light blinked on, a small, triumphant beacon in the darkness. My daughter's eyes widened with a quiet, terrified horror. She had no idea what was happening. She had no idea what I was doing. My son's body, which had been a looming threat in the small, confined space of the hallway, now stood frozen in place, a portrait of silent, terrifying fear. I looked at them, and in their eyes I saw not contempt, but a cold, dawning realization. The game had just changed, and they were about to lose. I listened to George's voice, a steady, unwavering stream of words on the speakerphone. He spoke of a deal. He spoke of a land developer, a man I had never heard of, a man who was known for his ruthless, unethical business practices. He spoke of a secret, signed agreement, a contract that had been drawn up just weeks after Eleanor's passing. The deal was to sell my house for double the price, an enormous sum of money that they had been planning to keep for themselves without telling me, without telling anyone. He spoke of my children's plans to take the money and leave me with nothing, to sell my house, to put me in a home. The words, once so cold and clinical, now felt like a final, devastating blow. I was not just a sentimental old man who was in the way. I was a problem to be solved. I was an obstacle to be overcome. I was a man who was about to be discarded. Do you know what people really think of you? I saw it now. I saw the cold, calculating look in my daughter's eyes. I saw the cold, detached professionalism in her husband's voice. They were not my children. They were not my family. They were just two desperate, greedy people who were willing to do anything, to hurt anyone, to get what they wanted. They had no idea that their greed, their betrayal, their contempt was about to become their undoing. The truth was out, and the truth, once revealed, was a poison that would now infect their lives. The silence that followed George's words was a thick, suffocating thing. My daughter's face, once so full of a cold, contemptuous defiance, was now crumpled, her eyes filled with a terrifying, gut-wrenching pain. My son's face, once so composed and confident, was now a mask of fear and shame. They didn't look at me. They couldn't. They were too busy looking at the wreckage of their own lives. They had come to me for a fight. They had come to me for a victory. But they had left with a truth that was more painful than any loss they could have ever imagined. The game had just begun, and I was going to make sure that in the end they would pay for their greed, for their lies, for their betrayal. What if everything you were taught was a lie? The words, the documents, the phone call. It had all led to this. My children, my own flesh and blood, had just left, their perfect, sterile world shattered by a single phone call. They had come to me for a fight, a battle over a piece of land they considered to be nothing more than an asset. They had no idea that the real battle had nothing to do with me, or with them, or with the money they believed was theirs. The real battle had been fought a long, long time ago, in a place that existed only in the quiet, dusty corners of my mind. The time for the truth was now. The time for the final revelation had come. I sat in my study, the small black voice recorder in my hand, and pressed the record button, the tiny red light blinking on, a single defiant beacon in the darkness. They think they know the truth, I said, my voice a low, steady rumble. They think the secret is that I'm a sad old man who needs to be taken care of. They have no idea that the real secret is about their mother, and about a fortune that was buried for 50 years under a single perfect oak tree. I closed my eyes, and the world began to fade. The scent of old books and aged paper was replaced by the fresh, crisp smell of pine and the cool, damp scent of a summer morning. The silence of my home was replaced by the soft, rhythmic lapping of water on the shore, the gentle, hypnotic sound of the lake breathing a silent, living breath. I was back. I was back at the cabin, in a time when Eleanor was alive, in a time when she was a woman full of life and a woman full of secrets. Do you know what people really think of you? I had always believed that Eleanor was a simple, honest woman. I had no idea that she was a woman who was a part of a long, long history of wealth and privilege, a history that she had kept hidden from me, from everyone. She had told me a story about her family, a simple, quiet story about a family of farmers, of a life of hard work and simple, honest living. She had no idea that I was a man who had been a banker for 50 years, a man who had learned to read the signs, to anticipate the dangers. And the signs were all there. The small, secretive trips to a town I had never heard of, the long, hushed phone calls in the middle of the night, the sudden, unexplainable wealth that had allowed us to buy the cabin. I had been a fool. I had been a man who had been blinded by a love that I had believed was true. But in my heart, I had always known. I had always known there was something she was keeping from me. I had no idea that the secret was a truth that was more powerful, more devastating than any lie she could have ever told me. On a warm, sunny afternoon, a few weeks after we had bought the cabin, she had come to me, her face a mask of quiet, determined resolve. She had a small, old, wooden box in her hands, a box that looked like it had been in her family for centuries. She didn't say anything. She just took my hand and led me to the edge of the lake, to a place where a single, perfect oak tree stood, its branches a wide, sheltering canopy against the relentless sun. The tree was a symbol of our love, a symbol of our promise to each other. We had planted it on our wedding day. It was our tree. And now, she was standing under it, a shovel in her hands, a secret in her eyes. She had dug a small, shallow hole at the base of the tree, and she had placed the box in it, her movement slow, deliberate, as if she were performing a ritual. She had covered the box with dirt, patted the ground with her hands, and then she had looked at me. Her eyes were filled with a profound, terrifying sadness. "This is for us," she had said, her voice a low, broken whisper. "This is a promise." And I had believed her. I had believed that the promise was about us, about our love, about our future. I had no idea that the promise was a lie. The secret she had buried under the tree was not a testament to our love. It was a testament to her past. She was not a simple farm girl. She was the daughter of a wealthy heir, a man who had left her a fortune that was so large, so immense, that it would have changed her life forever. But she had been betrayed. She had been betrayed by her own family, by a group of people who had tried to take her inheritance, who had tried to steal her dignity. She had run away. She had changed her name. She had started a new life, a life of quiet, simple dignity, a life that she had built with me. She had buried her secret under the oak tree because she didn't trust anyone, not her family, not the world, not even me. How much money do you lose every day without knowing it? My children had no idea that the cabin, the piece of property they had been fighting over, was nothing more than a front. They had no idea that the real fortune was buried just a few feet away, under a tree they had called a meaningless monument. They had been so consumed by their greed, by their desire for a few extra dollars, that they had been blind to the real treasure, to the real legacy. They had been trying to sell a piece of land they believed was worthless, when in fact, it was the key to a fortune they never knew existed. The irony was a cold, bitter wound. My wife, a woman who had been betrayed by her own family, had now been betrayed by her own children. They were destroying her legacy for the sake of a few pieces of paper. They were tearing down a home for the sake of a few extra dollars in their bank account. I looked at my voice recorder, the small red light blinking on, a silent, unmoving beacon in the darkness. The confession was over. The truth was out. The pieces of the puzzle were now in place. I was no longer a man who was fighting for a cabin. I was a man who was revealing a legacy. I was a man who was fighting for the truth. The final act had begun, and I was going to make sure that in the end they would pay for their greed, for their lies, for their betrayal. They had been fighting for a piece of land they believed was a fortune, but they had no idea that they had just lost a fortune, a fortune that was buried for 50 years under a single perfect oak tree. And they had no one to blame but themselves. What would happen if you stopped limiting yourself? They had stopped limiting themselves. Their greed, once a cold, contained hunger, had now turned into a wild, animalistic fury. They didn't wait for a knock, didn't bother with a fake show of concern. The front door of my house, the one I had built with my own hands, was thrown open with a violent, jarring thud. The sound was a harsh, final end to the silence that had so recently been my solace. My son, Robert, and my daughter Anna stood in the doorway, their perfect, polished veneer completely gone. Their faces were a portrait of desperation and rage, their eyes, once so cold and calculating, now burning with a mad, frantic fire. They were no longer my children. They were a pair of cornered animals, and they had come to destroy me. They didn't say a word. Their silence was more terrifying than any verbal threat. They just walked past me, their footsteps loud and jarring on the old floorboards, their bodies a looming, menacing threat in the small, confined space of my home. They went straight to my study. They knew what they were looking for. They knew about the voice recorder. They knew about the secrets I had buried. They had no idea that their greed, their lies, their betrayal was about to become their undoing. My son's face, which had been a mask of quiet, determined fury, was now a portrait of pure, unadulterated rage. He was a man who had been a boy who had stolen a few $1,000s from his father's safe. He had no idea that I was a man who had just taken his entire future from him. He was a man who was about to pay for a lifetime of lies. They went to my desk, their hands a blur of frantic, destructive motion. They pulled out the drawers, their contents spilling onto the floor, a scattered mess of old papers and forgotten tools. They were no longer looking for money. They were looking for the truth. They were looking for the voice recorder. They were looking for the proof of their mother's deception, the proof of their own cruelty, the proof of a lifetime of lies. My daughter Anna, her body a rigid, unforgiving line, went to the bookshelf, her hands pulling out books and throwing them on the floor in a fit of wild, uncontrollable rage. She was a woman who had been a girl who had been raised on a lie, and she was now a woman who was willing to destroy everything to get what she wanted. I stood in the doorway, a silent, unmoving presence in my own home, a witness to their destruction. My study, my sanctuary, my place of order and logic was now a battlefield, a place of chaos and violence. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a smell that was a cold, bitter reminder of the life they had just destroyed. I was a man who had believed in the sanctity of a promise. I was a man who had believed in the honesty of his children. I was a man who had been a fool, and now I was a man who was about to lose everything. What will you do if you had only one day left? That was a question I had asked myself 1,000 times, a philosophical musing on a quiet, solitary afternoon. But on that night, as I watched my children tear my home apart, the question was no longer a philosophical one. It was a cold, hard reality. My life, my dignity, my truth, all of it was at stake. My son's eyes, filled with a terrifying, animalistic fury, met mine. He saw me, a man who was no longer a father, but an enemy. He saw me, a man who was no longer a provider, but a threat. He lunged for me, his hands reaching for my throat. I was an old man. My body was frail, but my mind was still sharp, still quick. I was a man who had been a banker for 50 years, a man who had learned to survive, a man who had learned to fight. I ducked, my body a frail, bony shield, and his hands missed me, his fingers scraping against the back of my chair. My daughter Anna, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, had found it. The voice recorder. It was in her hands, a small black monument to the truth, a small unmoving piece of evidence that would expose their lies, that would destroy their perfect, sterile lives. She held it up, her eyes burning with a mad, triumphant fire. She was going to destroy it. She was going to erase my story. She was going to win, and I was going to lose everything. Do you know your true worth? That was a question I had never truly asked myself. I had always measured my worth in promises kept, in financial security, in the quiet, unspoken love that had defined my life. But in that moment, as I watched my daughter hold the voice recorder in her hand, as I watched her prepare to destroy the last piece of my dignity, I realized that my true worth was not in the money they had stolen, not in the dignity they had tried to take from me. My true worth was in the truth. My true worth was in the promise I had made to Eleanor. My true worth was in the life I had lived, and they were about to destroy all of it. I fell to the floor, my old bones protesting with a sharp, stinging pain, my body a silent, defeated mess. My daughter and her husband stood over me, their faces a study in cold, dawning horror. They had done it. They had won. They had the voice recorder. They had the evidence. They had my truth. And I had nothing. My heart was a cold, empty tomb, my mind a frantic, chaotic mess. I was a man who had lost everything, but I was also a man who had just found a new purpose. The betrayal was a cold, bitter wound, and the truth I had revealed was not a balm. It was a poison. It was a poison that would now infect their lives, that would haunt them for the rest of their days. The game had just begun, and I was going to make sure that in the end they would pay for their lies, for their cruelty, for their betrayal. Are you ready for the shocking truth? My grandson, Michael, had helped me get there. He had come to my house, his eyes wide with a quiet, terrified horror, and had helped me get the old Ford truck started. He had not asked any questions. He had not said a word. He had just looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a silent, unmoving promise. He was a boy who had just seen the cold, brutal violence that lay beneath his parents' perfect, polished veneer. He was a boy who had just seen the truth, and he had come to me, a silent, unwavering ally, a single flickering light of hope in the vast, empty darkness of my life. My daughter and her husband had followed us, their car a looming, menacing threat on the long, winding road to the cabin. They thought I was a sad, confused old man who was going to take one last look at his memories before he signed his life away. They had no idea that I was a man who was about to reveal a truth that would destroy their lives, a truth that would expose them for what they truly were. We arrived at the cabin, the old weathered wood a familiar comfort in the gray morning light. The lake was still, its surface a perfect mirror of the slate-gray sky. The air was cool and damp, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. My daughter and her husband emerged from their car, their faces a portrait of cold, determined fury. They didn't look at me. They didn't look at the cabin. They just looked at the land, their eyes filled with a hungry, desperate greed. They had no idea that they were standing on a battlefield. They had no idea that the final act had just begun. And they had no idea that they were about to lose everything. I walked to the edge of the lake, to a place where a single, perfect oak tree stood, its branches a wide, sheltering canopy against the relentless sky. It was a beautiful tree, a testament to a love that I had believed was as strong and as unyielding as the trees around us. I stood under the branches, my hands in my pockets, and looked at them. They stood at a distance, their bodies a rigid, unforgiving line. My son, Robert, his face a mask of cold, contemptuous defiance, and my daughter Anna, her eyes filled with a mad, triumphant fire. They were a team, a united front, and they had come to take what they believed was theirs. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I just looked at them, my eyes filled with a cold, unwavering resolve. They had no idea that I was a man who was about to reveal a secret that would make them tremble with fear. I looked at Michael, my grandson, his eyes wide with a quiet, terrified horror. I motioned for him to come to me. He walked to me, his footsteps silent on the damp earth. He was a boy who had just seen the cold, brutal violence that lay beneath his parents' perfect, polished veneer. He was a boy who was now about to become a man. I looked at him, and in his eyes I saw not pity, but a quiet, dawning understanding. He had seen the truth, and he had chosen a side. He had chosen me. I walked to the base of the oak tree, to the place where my wife had buried her secret so many years ago. I pointed to a small, unassuming patch of earth, a place where a single perfect flower was blooming. "Dig here," I said to Michael, my voice a low, steady rumble. "Your grandmother wanted you to find it." My daughter and her husband looked at me, their faces a study in cold, dawning horror. They had no idea what I was doing. They had no idea that they were standing on the very spot where their entire lives would come crashing down. My son, his voice a low, furious hiss, took a step towards me. "Dad," he said, his words filled with a cold, desperate fury. "What are you doing? You're going to get us all in trouble." But his words were empty. He was a man who was trying to stop a storm with a single, meaningless sentence. Michael didn't hesitate. He took the shovel I had placed in his hands and began to dig. The sound of the shovel hitting the dirt was a quiet, rhythmic sound, a sound that was a jarring contrast to the tense, silent stillness of the room. He was digging for a truth that had been buried for 50 years. He was digging for a secret that would destroy his family. My daughter and her husband stood there, their bodies a silent, unmoving testament to their defeat. They were no longer in control. They were no longer the ones with the upper hand. They had come to me for a fight, but they had just met a man who had been a banker for 50 years, a man who had learned to read the signs, to anticipate the dangers. They had no idea that the battle was no longer about money. It was about truth. The shovel hit something solid, a small wooden box, its surface covered in a fine layer of dirt. Michael pulled it out, his face a mask of awe and wonder. He had found it. He had found the truth. He opened the lid, and inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were documents. Not legal papers, but a will. A will that was signed by a man I had never known. A man who was a wealthy heir. A man who had left a fortune to his daughter, Eleanor. He had left her a fortune, and she had buried it under the oak tree, a place that was a testament to her love for me, a place that was a testament to her lack of trust in her own family. What will happen if you stop limiting yourself? My children had no idea that the cabin, the piece of property they had been fighting over, was nothing more than a front. They had no idea that the real fortune was buried just a few feet away, under a tree they had called a meaningless monument. They had been so consumed by their greed, by their desire for a few extra dollars, that they had been blind to the real treasure, to the real legacy. They had been trying to sell a piece of land they believed was worthless, when in fact, it was the key to a fortune they never knew existed. The irony was a cold, bitter wound. My wife, a woman who had been betrayed by her own family, had now been betrayed by her own children. They were destroying her legacy for the sake of a few pieces of paper. They were tearing down a home for the sake of a few extra dollars in their bank account. The final act had begun, and I was going to make sure that in the end they would pay for their greed, for their lies, for their betrayal. Do you know what people really think of you? That was a question my children had always answered with a carefully constructed lie. They believed they were seen as successful, as intelligent, as caring. But on that quiet, still morning by the lake, in the shadow of the old oak tree, the truth was finally revealed. The papers from the box were scattered on the damp earth, their fine print a chilling, undeniable truth. My daughter, Anna, and my son, Robert, stood frozen, their faces pale with shock and a horrifying, dawning realization. The words I had spoken were not just accusations. They were facts. They were the cold, hard, undeniable truth. Their perfect, carefully constructed world, a world built on a foundation of lies and a cruel inheritance, was crumbling before their very eyes. They looked at each other, and in their eyes I saw not love or support, but a raw, terrifying accusation. The united front they had presented to the world had just been torn to shreds. My son, Robert, was the first to speak, his voice a low, furious hiss. "You knew," he said, his words not for me, but for his sister. "You knew about the inheritance. You knew about the fortune. You knew about the secret. And you didn't tell me." His words were a low, guttural accusation, a cold, brutal slap to his sister's face. My daughter's face, once so full of a cold, contemptuous defiance, was now a mask of shame and fear. She shook her head, a silent, desperate denial. "I didn't know," she said, her voice a low, broken whisper. "I didn't know about the money. I just knew about the promise. I knew she didn't want the cabin sold." Her words were a lie, a cruel, calculated act of a woman who was trying to save herself. But it was too late. The damage had been done. They turned on each other, their whispers becoming low, furious accusations. The betrayal they were feeling was not a new thing. It was a cold, bitter wound that had been festering for years, a wound that had been hidden under a veneer of polite indifference. They blamed each other for their greed, for their lies, for their desire to take a piece of land they considered to be worthless. They had no idea that they were the victims of their own mother's cruelty, that they were just pawns in a long-con game. They had no idea that their greed was the very thing that had led to their own ruin. I watched them, their perfect, loving relationship, a relationship they had so carefully cultivated for the world to see, was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie, a house of cards that was now collapsing in on itself. The money, the inheritance, the house, all of it was gone. They had lost everything, and they had no one to blame but themselves. How much of your life have you already wasted? That was a question I had asked myself 1,000 times, a philosophical musing on a quiet, solitary afternoon. But on that day, as I watched my children tear each other apart, the question was no longer a philosophical one. It was a cold, hard reality. They had wasted their lives on a lie. They had wasted their lives on a greed that had been planted in them by their own mother. They had wasted their lives on a promise that was a lie. They had been fighting over a piece of land they believed was a fortune, but they had no idea that the real fortune was buried for 50 years under a single perfect oak tree. And they had no one to blame but themselves. I looked at Michael, my grandson. He was no longer a boy. He was a man. He had seen the truth. He had seen the cold, brutal violence that lay beneath his parents' perfect, polished veneer. He had seen a world of lies and deceit crumble before his very eyes. He had been a boy who had believed in a world of love and family. And in a single terrible moment, that world had been irrevocably shattered. He stood there, a silent, unmoving witness to their destruction, his eyes filled with a quiet, terrified horror. He had seen the truth, and he had chosen a side. He had chosen me. They didn't leave right away. They just stood there, their bodies a silent, unmoving testament to their defeat. The silence was broken only by my daughter's low, heartbroken sobs, a sound that was more painful than any angry word she could have spoken. My son, his hands clenched into tight fists, his face a mask of shame and fury, looked at me, a silent, unyielding gaze. He had no words. He had no excuses. He had just lost everything, and he had no one to blame but himself. They had come to me for a fight. They had come to me for a victory. but they had left with a truth that was more painful than any loss they could have ever imagined. My home, my sanctuary, was now a place of silent, terrible pain. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I didn't feel a sense of victory. I just felt a cold, empty stillness. The truth was out. The lies had been exposed. But it hadn't brought me peace. It had just left a gaping, yawning emptiness in its wake. The dignity I had lost at the funeral had been restored, but it had come at a terrible price. I had torn down a house of lies, but in doing so, I had also torn down a family. The betrayal I had felt was a cold, bitter wound, and the truth I had revealed was not a balm. It was a poison. It was a poison that would now infect their lives, that would haunt them for the rest of their days. I watched them stumble out of the house, their bodies a silent, defeated mess. They didn't look at me. They couldn't. They were too busy looking at the wreckage of their own lives. They had come to me for a fight. They had come to me for a victory. But they had left with a truth that was more painful than any loss they could have ever imagined. Do you know your true worth? That was a question I had finally answered. My worth was not in the money they had stolen, not in the dignity they had tried to take from me, but in a quiet, unwavering truth that had been buried for 50 years. The last echoes of their car tires on the gravel driveway were the last sound I heard before a profound, bone-deep silence settled over the house. It was a silence that was no longer heavy with grief or pain, but with a quiet, final sense of completion. The storm had passed, the chaos had subsided, and I was left in the wreckage of a life I had thought I knew. My children had left. They had left me with a heart full of a pain so deep, so consuming, it was almost a physical presence in the room. But they had also left me with a new beginning. I walked back to my study, the small black voice recorder in my hand, a silent testament to a truth that had been buried for 50 years. The papers from the box were scattered on the floor, their fine print a chilling, undeniable truth. My grandson, Michael, had helped me get them. He had been a silent, unmoving witness to a truth that had been buried for so long. He had been a boy who had just seen the cold, brutal violence that lay beneath his parents' perfect, polished veneer. He had been a boy who had just seen the truth. And he had come to me, a silent, unwavering ally, a single flickering light of hope in the vast, empty darkness of my life. He was a boy who had just lost his family, but he was also a boy who had just found his courage. He was a boy who had just become a man. I sat down in my leather armchair, the worn upholstery molding to my body like a second skin. I looked at the old photographs on my desk, the smiling faces of a man and a woman who had once believed in a world of love and honesty. The man I had been was a man who had been a fool. The woman I had loved was a woman who had been a thief. But the truth, once revealed, was a poison that would now infect their lives, that would haunt them for the rest of their days. I had not won a victory. I had not won a battle. I had just survived a war. And the price of survival was a solitude that was deeper, more profound than any I had ever known. How will you find out your true worth? That was a question I had asked myself 1,000 times, a philosophical musing on a quiet, solitary afternoon. But on that day, as I looked at the wreckage of a life I had thought I knew, I realized that my true worth was not in the money they had stolen, not in the dignity they had tried to take from me. My true worth was in the truth. My true worth was in the promise I had made to Eleanor. My true worth was in the life I had lived. And they were about to find out that the truth, once revealed, was a poison that would now infect their lives, that would haunt them for the rest of their days. I reached for the voice recorder, my hand trembling with a quiet, final sense of completion. I pressed the record button one last time, the small red light blinking on, a single defiant beacon in the darkness. The confession is over, I said, my voice a low, steady rumble. The truth is out. The lies have been exposed, and the consequences, they are for them to bear. I paused, the words hanging in the air, a silent, unmoving presence. They thought they were taking my life. They had no idea that I was just a man who was about to give them a life that was not their own. They thought they were taking my home. They had no idea that the real treasure was buried under a single perfect oak tree. I pressed the stop button, the tiny red light blinking off. The story was over. The journey was complete. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. I was a man who had been a banker for 50 years, a man who had learned to read the signs, to anticipate the dangers. I was a man who had been a husband for 50 years, a man who had believed in a world of love and honesty. And now, I was a man who had a new purpose, a new path forward. I looked at the old photographs on my desk, the smiling faces of a man and a woman who had once believed in a world of love and honesty. I took one of them, a small faded picture of Eleanor and me standing by the lake. I looked at her face, her eyes filled with a quiet, terrifying sadness. I didn't see a thief. I didn't see a liar. I just saw a woman who had been a victim of her own past, a woman who had been a victim of her own family. She had been a woman who had been betrayed, and now her children had betrayed her again. The irony was a cold, bitter wound. I walked to the kitchen, my feet dragging on the old floorboards, and I made a pot of coffee. I sat on the back porch, my old rocking chair a familiar, comforting presence. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a color palette that was a jarring contrast to the cold, still silence of my heart. I was a man who had lost everything, but I was also a man who had finally, truly, found his freedom. The truth, once revealed, was a cold, bitter wound, but it was also a foundation for a new life, a new beginning, a life that was no longer defined by lies and deceit, but by a quiet, simple dignity. The final scene of my story was not one of triumph or revenge. It was a scene of quiet, simple peace. I was in my garden, a place that had once been my wife's sanctuary, a place that had once been a testament to her lies. I was tending to the rose bushes, the same rose bushes that she had so carefully cultivated. I looked at the beautiful, vibrant blooms, and for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't feel a sense of loss or a sense of pain. I just felt a quiet, simple sense of peace. The roses were no longer a symbol of her lies. They were a symbol of my freedom. They were a symbol of a new beginning. I looked at the old wooden porch, the weathered boards a testament to a life that had been lived, a life that was now mine to live. I had a story to tell, and it was a story they would never, ever forget.